What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we dive into 5 budget decks that I have put together and kind of play tested here in Arena. It has been a minute since I've dropped a budget deck video, and I figured I'd come up with 5 decent budget decks that could get you started in Arena. If you're looking for something that's a little bit more than, say, the starter decks the game gives you, each of these decks is a little bit unique, as I do think each of these have a pretty decent path to, with a few upgrades, become a decent meta deck to get you started, which also helps out newer players. But with that out of the way, let's just dive into the decks and let's just start talking about them. So this first deck up is kind of a deck I think I've covered once before here on the channel, but I think is a deck that is relatively approachable for a new player, and that's Boros Artifacts. I think this is one of those decks that maybe is pretty good, okay for the most part what it's trying to do. It's kind of like a Selesnya Enchantments deck, if you know what that one is. But instead of enchantments, where our focus is around artifacts, and the main card of the deck that kind of helps this deck get going is going to be the Patchwork Automaton. This is a card that whenever we cast an artifact spell, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on Patchwork Automaton, which is definitely very good, and it has Ward 2, so it's hard to get rid of, especially in that early game. So this card is one of those cards that we can grow pretty quickly, and it'll make it hard for our opponent to really get rid of. Outside of that, the deck is really low curve, so most of the spells in our deck are either 1 or 2 mana, with the outlier being the Imperial Recovery unit at 3 mana. And this card's actually pretty decent for this style of deck because it's a card that whenever it attacks, we actually get to return things back from our graveyard, artifact, and or vehicle to our hand with mana value 2 or less. And our deck has a lot of things that, if they do die in the early game, that definitely benefit us in the later game. You can either even get back a Patchwork Automaton if it does end up dying, but still, nonetheless, this is a pretty straightforward budget list, I would say. Looking at the 1-drops, we have Hotshot Mechanic. This card's pretty good in the sense that it's 1 mana 2/1. It is an artifact itself, and the fact that it can target, it can crew vehicles, though it's power 2 or greater. So instead of it crewing for 2, it could crew up to vehicles that are 4, though we don't play any vehicles that are that crazy. Just having a pilot in the deck that helps us crew our vehicles is definitely not that bad. We got Experimental Synthesizer, another 1-drop artifact that allows us to exile top card of our library, and we can play that card until the end of our turn, and then if it does leave the battlefield, the trigger happens again, and we can even sacrifice it and get a 2/2 Samurai token if we need to, get some pressure on the battlefield or just get some sort of presence on the battlefield. Overall, pretty decent 1-drop common card. Next card up is Rabbit Battery, another solid 1-drop card. It's a 1 mana 1/1 with haste, and an equipped creature gets +1/+1 and also gets haste. So, turn 1, you can play this attack in. Turn 2, you could equip it to something or play another 1-drop. Maybe it doesn't have, it has Summon Sickness, but you can give it haste, and that creature now is a 2/2. So definitely not a bad card there. Overall, pretty decent, cheap artifact spell that really gets the job going. Then we have Simian Sling. It's another 1 mana 1/1 artifact creature. A quick creature gets +1/+1, and then whenever Simian Sling or a quick creature becomes blocked, it deals 1 damage to dependent player. So yet again, even if our opponent chumps blocks, and we still can get at least a point of damage through, in the early game, this card's not bad as well. Sometimes our opponent doesn't want to take that 1 additional damage, and they'd rather just take the 1 from the creature. So overall, pretty decent card there. For some spot removal, we do have Voltage Surge, 4 copies of it. As additional cost to cast a spell, we can sacrifice an artifact. When we do, instead of it doing 2 damage to target creature or planeswalker, it deals 4 damage instead. Definitely very good. Hits a lot of things at instant speed. Getting things out of our way is kind of the key thing for this deck. Outside of that, we have Iron Apprentice, a 1 mana 0/0 construct creature that when it enters the battlefield, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on it. When it dies, if it had counters on it, put those counters on target creature we control. So this is just kind of one of those things that we can chump block, we can sacrifice, we can do various things with, and kind of pass the +1/+1 counters around. This is also one of those cool cards that we can get back with Imperial Recovery Unit when it attacks, and allows us to kind of replay this and kind of get that effect yet again. Because we are an artifact deck, our big enchantment that kind of puts a lot of pressure on really quickly is Mashako, Brain of Truth. It's a 2 mana enchantment saga that has 2 chapters that target creature gets +1/+1 to end a turn for each artifact and or enchantment we control. Our deck is primarily outside of maybe one creature that is pretty much enchantments and or artifacts, so definitely, it could hit really hard very early. And then on the 3rd chapter, we flip it over, we get the 0/0 side of it that gets +1/+1 for each artifact or enchantment control, so we get a pretty decently large creature as well as the game is going on. So overall, very solid, uncommon enchantment that kind of helps put pressure on our opponent. Next card up is Sokuzan Smelter. It's a 2 mana 2/2. At the beginning of our combat, we may pay 1. If we do, we sacrifice an artifact and then create a 3/1 artifact creature token that replaces said artifact. Definitely a good card to outlet with Experimental Synthesizer, just because it allows us to sacrifice that, get another card off the top of our library, and then therefore get a 3/1 artifact out of it, and then maybe have another card to play after combat is over. Definitely a solid card there. We have Yorda Declares War. It's a 2-mana enchantment with the Read Ahead ability, the new ability from Dominaria United that on chapter 1, we created a 0/2 artifact Thopter creature token with flying named Ornithopter, so definitely cool there. Chapter 2 is we can tap any number of untapped artifacts we control, not just creatures, but also artifacts that may be just on the battlefield, and we can deal that much damage to target creature or planeswalker, so it has a built-in kind of removal effect. And then on the third chapter, we give target artifact we control base power and toughness 4/4 until end of turn. So either we give the Ornithopter, we give like a Patchwork Automaton, and if that has counters on it, it will become a 4/4 and then add those counters onto it, so making it that much larger. Overall, very solid enchantment card for the deck. We also have 2 copies of the High-Speed Hover Bike, 2-mana 2/2 flash flying vehicle that when it enters the battlefield, we can tap up to 1 target creature. So if our opponent has something in the way, we can at the end of turn maybe tap it down. If they are going to be aggressive, possibly attack in with it. We can also tap it down before combat, which is definitely very good. And it only accrues for 1, so we can use one of our little small creatures and actually accrue this up, which is definitely good as well. We already went over the Patchwork Automaton, but definitely a solid card for the deck. Definitely can get very big very, very quickly if your opponent doesn't do anything about it. And then, like I said, in the 3-drop slot, we have the 2 copies of the Imperial Recovery Unit, 3-drop, 3/4. Doesn't have flying, but whenever it attacks, we get something back from the graveyard that costs 2 or less to our hand, either artifact and or vehicle, which is definitely good as well. And then the mana base is pretty straightforward. For the most part, you have plains, you have mountains, and we have some tapped dual lands. I would say, this is one of those decks, I think out of all of them, this is one of the decks that may improve with Brothers War with what rares and mythics you could add to the deck. There are a few cards that I would say currently you could add that may be beneficial if you have them in your collection or maybe want to craft them. First one up being is Lion's Sash. It's a 1-mana 1/1 or 2-mana 1/1 artifact that has the exile ability. We exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a permanent card, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on Lion's Sash. So as long as we exile land, creature, planeswalker, anything that would stick on the battlefield when your opponent would cast it, or even on our side, we can put counters on it. And then we can also equip it to target creature we control, and it gets +1/+1 for each +1/+1 counter on Lion's Sash. And it still has the ability, so we can still eat things from the graveyard, which is definitely very good. We also have Lizard Blades, yet again another card here that's a 2-mana 1/1 with double strike. We can either reconfigure it and equip and give target creature double strike, or itself it will just have double strike, and we can always put those Iron Apprentice counters on this, and it becomes bigger and bigger, and opponent has to deal with. Also a very solid card to line up with the Mashako's Reign of Truth, just because it's one of those things that will become pretty big, and your opponent has to kind of deal with it, or they're going to take a big chunk of damage. Sundown Pass is another card. You probably swap out your tap dual lands, the Windscarred Crags, with this. It's a very solid dual land. I actually think you could probably put one in the deck if you have the red-white starter deck unlocked. That's something you could definitely add to the deck if you have that deck unlocked. Worst case scenario, these are definitely very good. It helps us keep the deck pretty aggressive. And on top of that, in I believe Brothers War, we're also going to get the Pain land that produces red and white mana, which is definitely going to help the deck as well. It will allow us to be a little bit more aggressive. So that's definitely another card I would look out for from Brothers War when it comes to lands. And then I haven't fully assessed the whole set, but there are a lot of artifacts in the set that are in the red and white colors, or cards that help benefit us when we cast red or white artifacts. It's definitely going to be one of those things as we kind of see how Brother War comes into the set, we can really figure out what will help us overall. Just to help us out overall. This is definitely a deck I even think in this budget version is still a pretty solid deck. Definitely a fun deck if you're someone who's looking for something that's aggressive. Maybe you're not a Selesnya player, but maybe you're more of a Boros Aggro player. This is definitely something to check out. And like I said, this deck doesn't require any rares, so it's definitely pretty approachable, even with the limited budget. And the other thing too is if you're looking to maybe open packs to help you benefit and look for cards that would be beneficial to this deck. Most of the cards I think in this set are all from Kamigawa. I think outside of Yawa Declares War, everything else is from Kamigawa, so you can just focus on opening packs from that, and then only craft the cards that are from sets outside of Kamigawa. So definitely, like I said, approachable deck, very budget friendly, definitely can be really, really good and very explosive very, very early. Definitely sets itself up to be a competitor in the meta. I think with Brothers War comes out will become a lot better overall. But with that out of the way, let's move on to the next deck. So the next deck up on the list is kind of a deck I probably talk about a lot. It's probably the most approachable of these, and definitely a very solid top meta deck currently in the standard meta, and that is Selesnya Enchantments. Overall, the idea of this deck is we play a bunch of enchantments, kind of like the last deck that was Boros Aggro that played a lot of artifacts. This one's where we're focuses on playing a bunch of enchantments, and the idea with the deck is just to kind of put pressure on an opponent that way. The card that's similar between the two decks is Mishako's Reign of Truth, a card that gets +1/+1 to target creature based on how many enchantments and or artifacts we control. Our deck for the most part is primarily enchantments, so we do get a big bonus from that. I think the only card in the budget version of the deck that is an enchantment in the main deck outside the mana base is the Generous Visitor, but the benefit of this card is that whenever we cast an enchantment spell, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, so definitely very good uncommon for the deck at 1 mana. The other thing here is we do play Jukai Naturalist, a card that's great for this deck that makes any enchantment spell we cast cost 1 less to cast, meaning all our enchantments that are above, 3 will become 1 less. Any of the enchantments that are in 2 become essentially just 1 mana enchantments, which are definitely very good. So definitely allows us to kind of put a lot of pressure on our opponent very, very quickly. If we get one of these out on turn 2 and have a lot of mana open and this survives on turn 3, we could definitely pump out a lot of enchantments, which will definitely benefit us, not only for Mishako's Reign of Truth, but definitely, allowing us to play things that would remove things from the battlefield like Circle Confinement, Borrowed Time, even Touch of the Spirit Realm. All these exile target creature or target permanent, depending on which one, from the battlefield until they leave the battlefield. And then our big top end card of the deck, which isn't the most powerful, but definitely not a bad card to have because we do play a lot of enchantments, is the Skyblaze Samurai, a 7 mana 4/4 with flying. Though its benefit here is it does cost 1 less to cast for each enchantment we control. And like I said, everything in the deck outside of one card is an enchantment, so it's definitely not, it's definitely very easy to play this very, very early, maybe even on turn like 3 or turn 4, depending on if we have a Naturalist out and how many other enchantments we have out. This is definitely a deck that can be very explosive, like I said, because of its cheap mana base. Really, it's a 2 and 3. Like 3 is the most expensive. You're never really going to play this for 7. If you're playing it for 7, you're probably behind in the game. But still, nonetheless, not bad overall. And then, like I said, in the sideboard, in this, we do have a bunch of other cards that you can look into. Maybe you already own some copies of this. One of them being Kami. This is a great card for the deck, as it is a card that will put +1/+1 counters every time we cast an enchantment on itself. It has Trample. It's a 2/2. If one of our enchantments would lead the battle, would be put into the graveyard from the battlefield this turn, we can return it from our graveyard to our hand. So if it does die, we can get it back if something leaves the battlefield. Not just enchantments, but also enchantment creatures. Weaver Harmony is going to buff our enchantment creatures overall team-wise, but they give them all additional +1/+1, which is definitely very good. If we cast an enchantment spell, we can tap a green and tap it. We can copy said ability and trigger it a second time. So you can copy, the ability of Borrowed Time and do it twice and put 2 cards underneath Borrowed Time. You can copy the ability of Mishako's Reign of Truth. You can even copy the ability of Spirited Companion and just draw that additional card. Overall, very, very solid card, in the sideboard that you can look into upgrade. Catilda is another great card here. Itself is a star creature. It has power and toughness based on number of spirits and or enchantments to control. As our deck is primarily enchantments, this card can get very, very big as well. This is another good card that kind of gets over the top of our opponent. It also has lifelink, so we can get a big chunk of life depending on how big the creature is. And then it has that Disturb ability, which is an ability that you can cast it from the graveyard by paying its Disturb cost, and it becomes a legendary enchantment itself and gives whatever creature's enchanted is the same exact ability. It just goes to a creature, which is definitely very good as well, giving it the lifelink, power toughness based on how many enchantments you control, in addition to the power and toughness that creature already has. Wedding Announcement's another solid card. You could add one of these into the deck currently, as I do think this is also in a starter deck, one of the dual color starter decks that you unlock, so you can add this in, maybe cut down on one of your 3-drop enchantments, or even cut down on the Candle Traps if you're not really a big fan, as the deck does have a lot of ways to kind of remove things from the battlefield. I think Wedding Announcement is definitely another solid card for this deck. Itself is an enchantment card, and as it kind of triggers multiple times, either if you don't attack or attack with 1 or less creatures, you get to create a 1/1 creature on the battlefield, which is definitely very good. You can use it as a chump blocker. You can use it as maybe a card to target with like a Mishako's Reign of Truth. And then on the third chapter, it flips over to the Festivity and gives the whole board additional +1/+1. If we also attack him with 2 or more creatures, this will allow us to draw a card, which is definitely going to help you keep the pressure on and kind of hopefully finding more answers. And then another card that's definitely very solid for the deck, though I would say depending on what version you want to play, there are many versions. There's some that play this card, there's some that don't play this card. Maybe you add this as a one-of. It's an enchantment card that, as long as we control 7 or more enchantments, creatures we control have flying and vigilance. And then whenever we cast an enchantment spell, we create a white spirit creature token, and its power and toughness are equal to the other spirits we control. This actually lines up pretty well with the Catilda in the late game. Maybe you have Catilda out, and then you played Hallowed Haunting, then all of a sudden you start having these spirits. This buffs Catilda on top of the enchantments. Overall, pretty interesting card for the deck, though, like I said, it's a mythic. It's not something you need to play to make the deck work. I actually think the top meta version of the deck doesn't actually play any of them. It's just mostly a combination of these top cards plus whatever's currently here in the main deck. Really, the only thing that really gets taken out of this is probably the amount of creature removal. As you need some, but if you can put pressure on your opponent, it's really just probably something like this. These are the cards that come out, and then you kind of cycle some of these cards in. The other thing I have in the sideboard as upgrades is a Ganjo and Boseyu. You probably just want 1 and 1 of each, just because they're legendary lands. You can only have 1 out, but the reason why we play them is because of their channel ability, which is definitely can be used as spot removal. Either this one for non-basic lands, artifacts, enchantments, which are definitely very good. This one can deal 4 damage to target attacking or blocking creature for 3 mana. Both very, very solid. But still, nonetheless, this is definitely a good deck to check out. And definitely, like I said, it's definitely very approachable. I do have the 1 Overground Farmland. If you do have the green-white starter deck unlocked, you can add that to the deck. You can also just, if you don't have this one unlocked, you can always just add another Blossom and Sand. But still, nonetheless, Selesnya Enchantments is probably one of the best budget decks that currently are out there. If you haven't tried it already, it's definitely a pretty good deck in general. And the next deck up is Gruul Aggro. This is another interesting budget deck. It's definitely a very effective deck. Doesn't really actually require a bunch of rares and mythics to make it super effective. I would say the one thing the budget version lacks compared to its upgraded version, which is like the more of the meta version of Gruul Aggro, is that it has to play a couple extra tap lands, which definitely slows down the deck, and it doesn't maybe have the best top end of the deck that you would typically have if you had some of the more expensive rares and mythics in the deck. But still, nonetheless, it does have a lot of good stuff in that early game to put a lot of pressure on that maybe we don't need those big cards to kind of get us to the finish line. Typically this deck is kind of like playing around the new card. Yamavaya Ironclast is a solid 2-drop, that in the fact that it's just a 3/2 for 2. Even you line it up with something like a Kamano Faces like Kakazan, it comes on the battlefield on turn 2 as even a 4/3, which is definitely very solid. The upside is if you do have it in play on turn 3, you give it +1/+1 and hasten to end of turn, so it can attack in immediately as a 4/3, so definitely not bad there. We have a couple Phoenix Chicks in the deck, just other solid 1-drops in that they're uncommons. It's a 1/1 flyer haste that attacks in immediately, which is definitely very good. We have 4 copies of Play with Fire, 4 copies of Lightning Strike to put pressure on our opponent's creatures and or life total if we need to. We have Riveteer Questionnaires. Just 1 copy of him. He's not bad. It's a 2-mana 3/1. Upside here is that when it dies, we get a treasure tokens just in case our opponent blocks. Maybe we get a little bit of extra ramp out of it. We have a couple Cacique Naturalists in the deck, and the fact that whenever it attacks, we can add green or red, which definitely can benefit us in the second main phase, where we can then follow up with a big creature. And then it also has a Nightbound Daybound cycle, whereas that is not as important just because we're not playing a bunch of wolves and werewolves in the deck. It's really more so here in the deck for that 2-drop that it can be super effective and very aggressive in one way or the other. In like the 3-drop slot, we have things like Jewel Thief, which is definitely a solid card in the fact it's a 3-mana 3/3 Vigilance Trampler. Also comes in the battlefield to create a treasure token, which can be used to either spot removal something or maybe even follow up with another play. We also have Spore Crawler, just another card in the deck that when it dies, we get to draw a card, so allowing us to dig a little bit deeper. We have Hook Hand Mariner. Kind of this is like our big top end card of the deck, 4-mana 4/4 Daybound Nightbound thing. Probably the only card that's benefits from the Naturalist in the deck. But the upside here is it does flip to Night Ever. It can't be chump blocked with it being a 6/4, which is definitely very good. And then the other card we have in the deck is just Wendon Flame, just because I do think the problem with a lot of aggro decks is that they run into things like Shieldred or big creatures. And it's just a 3-mana instant speed spell that deals 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker. And the added benefit is if the creature or planeswalker, if it's a spirit that we target with the spell, we get to do 2 damage to the controller. So overall, not a bad deck. Definitely very aggressive. Definitely low to the ground. Yet again, I would say this is probably, in a weird way, as much as it looks like a very 1, 2, 3, 4 style deck. Really, the deck can get going with just playing like 1 and 2 drops for the most part, and kind of put pressure on that way. You definitely get your opponent really low on life total pretty quickly. With just playing your playing on curve, which is definitely very good for this deck. In the sideboard, we have a couple of things that you can look at for to maybe upgrade into. One of them being Ascendant Pack Leader, very solid card. This is one of those weird things where I probably would get rid of things like Cacique Naturalist and put in some pack leaders, just because, like I said, Naturalist really isn't adding additional benefit. This being a 1-mana 2/1, and then as the game goes on, if we play some expensive things, it gets bigger. Rada's Firebrand is another solid card. Could also, replace Naturalist with this. It's a card that whenever we attack, or whenever it attacks, target creature defending player controls a power less than Rada, can't block this turn, and then does have the domain ability, allowing us to give it +2/+2, which then makes us be able to target a much larger creature. Quarian Beastcaller is another good card for the deck, just because it's one of those cards that whenever we cast a spell after we cast it, we get +1/+1 counters on this, and then whenever it dies, as long as it's not exiled, we get to distribute X +1/+1 counters among creatures we control based on the number of counters that are on it. Stormseeker is a solid 3-drop in the deck, just because the fact that it gives target creature +1/+0 on the front side, and haste end of turn. If we get it to the flip side, it gives that same creature +2/+0, trample and haste, which makes it a little bit better, and also becomes a 3/4. We got Squee here. This is probably like one of those cards that if you have like a copy of, that's great. If you don't have any copies of, I would say this is probably like the last card, just because it's a card that you just kind of have in the deck. It's not a card that you need to have 4 copies of. It's legendary. I would say this is like you want like a copy of if you're going to play it at all. Thunder Raiju is kind of like that big top end card in the deck, because it's one of those cards that's a 3-mana 3/3 or 4-mana 3/3 haster. That when it attacks, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature control, and then we deal damage to the opponent based on how many modified creatures we control, and that could change. Itself can also get the +1/+1 counter as well, though you won't do any damage that way if you don't have any other modified creatures. And the last card up, and this is kind of where I get, maybe if you're trying to figure out which card I need to upgrade, I would say it's probably a toss-up between these two. Like I said in the beginning of going over this deck kind of lacks that big top-end explosiveness, and both of these cards will kind of give you that as you slowly upgrade the rest of the deck. So I would say you probably want to look at Helena and Elena, as a card, possibly do it, because it's a 2/3 reach card with first strike and reach. It also can give target creature control +X +1/+1 counters based on its power, and that creature also gains haste, so it allows us to turn things on and become more aggressive. These two in tandem allow Thunder Raiju's ability to be that much better. And then the other cards that you can look for, like every other deck, are some of the dual lands. You can add additional copies of Rockfall Vale. Compulsion Forest is also very good, and a copy of Sokuzan and Boseyu is also very solid for the deck. But like I said, it's one of those things when it comes to upgrading. I would say you start at the top end, just because that's where the deck is lacking. Storm Seekers, you probably replace, things like, your Spur Crawlers. Same thing, Beast Caller. You probably get rid of like Jewel Thief, Naturalist are probably cards that would leave the battlefield. The Rivetier's Questioner is also another card that you probably want to remove. It's just definitely finding that right balance of how many copies of each you want. You can slowly, build one by one. So if you add a Beast Caller in, maybe remove the Questioner. You add another Beast Caller in, you remove a Naturalist, so on and so forth. It's kind of like the easiest way to really go about it. But like I said, if you're going to start anywhere with the deck, I would say start in the 4-drop slot and then work your way down that way. With that being said, let's move on to the next deck. So the next deck up on this list is another like tempo style deck, definitely aggressive in what it's trying to do. But instead of being like the mono blue tempo, we're kind of going more of the aggressive Izzet Tempo deck, playing a mixture of burn spells as well as protection spells for our creatures, and just having ways to put additional pressure on our opponent overall. This deck is on the cheap side, meaning that, there aren't any rares in the deck. The curve overall is fairly low. As you see here, we have lands, we have 2-drops, and we have 1-drops. That is the deck. That's kind of all you really need for the deck, just because it's kind of one of those things that all we're trying to do is curve out with like a 1, a 2-drop, maybe a couple 2-drops, and then really just kind of put pressure on our opponent that way. The couple main cards in the deck that really help this deck put a lot of pressure on really, really quickly. One being Electrostatic Infantry. This is a great 2-drop in the fact that it's a 1/2 with trample, and then whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on itself. So over the course of the game, it's going to grow, get bigger. Definitely something that is pretty solid. Another card in the deck, kind of similar to the last one, but this one's kind of a 2-mana 1/3 flyer. that whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, creatures we control get +1/+0 and trample at the end of turn. So it gives all our creatures trample. So even if our opponent like chump blocks are, we're going to get in through for some big damage, which is definitely pretty sweet. We also play Delver in the 1-drop slot. Very solid card here. It starts off as a 1/1. At the beginning of our upkeep, we get a flip ability where we get to possibly reveal the top card of our library. If it was an instant or sorcery card that we revealed this way, we get to flip Delver into a 3/2. So the idea here is hopefully we draw this on turn 1, play it on turn 1, and then maybe the most ideal way is that you flip it on turn 2, which is definitely, very, very good and allows us to be pretty aggressive pretty quickly because you can attack it for 3 essentially on turn 2 as long as it doesn't die. And then the last card in the deck that's kind of creature-wise that helps out with what we're trying to do is the Flame Channeler. It's a 2-mana 2/2 that when a spell we control deals damage, not to the player, not just to a creature, it just deals damage in general. We get to transform it into a 3/3, and then it gets the ability of whenever a spell we control deals damage, we get to put a flame counter on it, and we can remove flame counters by paying 1, and we can exile the top card of our library, and we can play this card until the end of our turn, or this turn, I should say. So definitely not a bad card. It's something that is pretty effective what we're trying to do, as we do have a mixture of burn spells in the deck as well as other spells that kind of help maybe protect our creatures overall. So, like I said, this deck is a bunch of very, very cheap spells, very, very cheap creatures, but if your opponent doesn't have any sort of way to really deal with them, this deck can really overwhelm you pretty quickly. And I actually think, there's a couple cards I think from Brothers War that this deck will benefit from. I can't remember the name of the card, but there's a reprint, I believe, of a card that's a 1-mana 1/2 with Prowess, which is essentially every time we cast an instant or sorcery spell, we get to give that creature +1/+1 until end of turn. So definitely another good card that will be coming from Brothers War. This is definitely one of those decks, if your opponent doesn't have any spot removal, this can get very overwhelming. We do play a lot of spells that will disrupt what our opponent's trying to do. We have counter spells like Make Disappear. We have Spell Pierce for a cheap 1-mana counter spell, as these cards will hopefully counter our opponent's spot removal and or big spells, non-creature spells in general. Make Disappear is definitely very good, especially in the early game, because a lot of times your opponent's tapping out, therefore not usually having that 2 to pay. Worst case scenario, we do have to sacrifice maybe one of our creatures to copy this spell and make them have it to pay 4 for a particular spell, which is definitely not that bad still. We also play Shore Up in the deck, as it's a solid card that gives target creature we control +1/+1 and hexproof. Also untap said creature, so your opponent may think we're tapped out. We untap a creature, surprising them, and then all of a sudden we block that creature and their creature dies. And like I said, just a bunch of cheap cantrip spells. Consider we have 4 ofs. We have 2 Flame Blessed Bowls, just because Underdog and stuff like that is currently popping in the format. We have Play with Fire as well, dealing 2 damage to any target, either our opponent or their creatures or Planeswalker. And then on top of that, if we deal to their face, we get the Scry 1, which is definitely solid as well. And like I said, the mana base is on the budget side, in the sense that you don't need a lot to really get this deck going. We do have 4 copies of Swiftwater Cliffs. We also have 1 Stonecart Cove. I also think something you can look out for is the Painland. If you have any copies of those, the red-blue Painland will definitely help out this deck, allowing us to be more aggressive, as we want to make sure we're casting things early on to put a lot of pressure on our opponent. But still, nonetheless, an overall very, very good, effective deck. Cards they could look at to possibly upgrade would be Haughty Djinn. I think is like the one card that makes the most sense for the deck. It's not like anything super crazy. You don't have to have 4 copies. I would say maybe 2 copies is even good, as this is a card that's going to benefit from all these spells we're casting throughout the game. As its power goes up, the more spells we cast. So definitely not a bad top end card of the deck. I don't know if you want to play 4 when it comes to upgrading, just because you want to keep the deck on the lower budget side, just because you want to be able to play a creature, maybe cast a spell or cast multiple spells. And then the rest of the upgrade options would be like Otawara, just a copy of to bounce something back. Sokuzan, just maybe if you need some chump blockers or want to put additional pressure, because this will line up actually pretty good with, like, say, something like a Balmor. You cast this at the end of your opponent's turn, and then you maybe cast a spell with Balmor on the battlefield. All those tokens now are 2/1 tramplers, which are definitely not that bad. And like I was saying before, Shivian Reef, another solid Painland that you can add into the deck to keep on being aggressive. You cut down on the mountains and islands in the deck, and then Stonecart Cove, you probably get rid of the Swiftwater Cliffs and just replace the rest of them with this. So overall, this deck is relatively on the cheap side, definitely very good and very aggressive deck. It's definitely maybe a lot better now that Meathook Massacre is gone, just because the deck is on the fairly small creature side, but still nonetheless an overall very, very good deck. And the last deck up on the list is going to be Orzhov Sacrifice Budget. This is another deck that's definitely kind of on the fun side. I actually kind of like a lot of the tricks that this deck does. It's a deck that's Yet again, just like all the other decks on this list, isn't super expensive with the creatures and the spells we're casting. This, out of all of them, is probably the deck that has the most rares in it initially. As I would say, the one thing you probably want for this deck is 4 copies of Wedding Announcement. This is a card that even if you're not going to play this deck, or maybe down the line you decide to play a different deck, this is a card that's kind of everywhere in Standard at the moment, as long as you splash white in one way or the other. Maybe outside of playing mono white, but this is definitely a solid card. So if you craft it now and decide that you don't want to play this deck anymore in the future, you didn't really waste wild cards on this one because this card is just that good. But still, the idea of this deck is what we're trying to do is put pressure on our opponent by sacrificing our creatures, getting us card advantage in that way. We do this in a couple various different ways. We have Dockside Chef is a card that we can tap 2 mana, sacrifice an artifact or a creature. We get to draw a card, which is definitely very good. A card we play that I think helps the overall sacrifice thing is actually Gruul's Procession. It's a 2 mana enchantment that whenever one or more non-token creatures die, we create a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decay. This ability only triggers once each turn, which is, I think, a very solid kind of combo with a lot of the cards we have in the deck. The reason why it's a great combo card is that, we can attack him with the 2/2 Decayed zombie token. It dies or, something like that, and then we can get back like a Cult Conscript from the graveyard because this is that we create a zombie token. The zombie token dies. We then can pay the 2 mana, get this back on the battlefield, and almost create that infinite loop in the sense that zombie token dies, you get back a Cult Conscript. We can sacrifice Cult Conscript, get a zombie token, so on and so forth. So definitely very solid kind of enchantment card for the deck. Other cards we have to help sacrifice is something like a Benelash Sleeper to 2 mana 3/1 that has a kicker ability of 1 black. When it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, each player sacrifices a creature. Yet again, we can sacrifice like something like a Cult Conscript. We can sacrifice one of our Decayed zombie tokens just because it's as much as a 2/2. It's just one of those things that when it attacks, it dies anyway. So might as well get some value out of it. Definitely a good card there. We have also Phyrexian Missionary in the deck. This is another interesting card that if any of our creatures die that we maybe want to get back, we can pay 2 additional mana on top of its original cost. Also return a creature card from our graveyard to our hand, and itself is a 2/3 for 2 mana, so definitely not a bad card just to put out on the battlefield to kind of put, a decent blocker because your opponent may not want to attack into a lifelinker, so definitely a solid card for 2 mana. Other than that, we also have Flesh Taker. So whenever we sacrifice another creature, we get to gain 1 life and scry 1, and itself also has a sacrifice ability of sacking a creature, giving it +2/+2 to end a turn. Definitely good there. We have a couple of Fell Stingers in the deck, a 3 mana 3/2 Death Toucher with the exploit ability that whenever it exploits a creature, we can make target player draw 2 cards and lose 2 life, which is definitely another solid card I think that helps out this deck overall. But like I said, overall, the idea here is we're just trying to cycle in draw effects, try to find as much value as possible. This deck is, it's fairly on the budget side in the sense, like I said, it's on a low curve. It also doesn't play a lot of rares. It doesn't take too much to really upgrade this deck in general to maybe a little bit more of a mid-range deck if that's what you're looking to play in the Orzhov colors. Everything else in the deck, we play a couple copies of Cut Down just for some spot removal. We play a couple copies of Infernal Grasp. Yet again, another good kind of spot removal card. We have Spirit Companions in the deck as just a solid 2-drop that also draws you a card for a 1/1. We also have a couple copies of Elias Core, Sadistic Pilgrim, just a 2 mana 2/2 with Death Touch that whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control, we get to gain a life. Whenever another creature we control dies, we get to make an opponent lose a life. We play a couple copies of Red Oblivion, just another card that allows us to sacrifice one of our non-land permanents and exile non-land permanent, which is definitely very good, and then we get to flash it back. We also play Wedded Announcement. Not only is this kind of one of those things that I think the deck needs just because we play a lot of small creatures, it does create also sacrifice fodder in the triggers that it gets as well. And then when we get to that third trigger, we get the additional +1/+1 to the team, which definitely makes our deck that much more aggressive. So instead of just having 2/2 Decayed zombie tokens, we have a 3/3 Decayed zombie tokens. Definitely overall pretty good there. And then just maybe depending on how you want to go, I added some cards to our sideboard just as possible stuff to make better. Evolve Sleeper is a solid card for the deck because it's a card to sink mana into. On the third time you actually trigger it for 3 mana, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on it. You draw a card, lose a life. Definitely not bad there. Sarah Paragon, I think, is definitely a key card for the deck. Definitely one of those cards maybe we want to look out for early, just because it's a card that will allow you to play any of our spells in our deck outside of itself from our graveyard again. And then on top of it, if the creature would leave the battlefield this time, you actually exile it and gain 2 life. You probably don't want to, cast your Cold Consequence from the graveyard, but definitely cast anything else from the graveyard is definitely very good. Allows you to possibly replay things like Spirited Companion, Ghoulish Procession if your opponent somehow removed it. Even something like a sleeper, again, you know, if you want to do that, definitely good card there. Shieldred, yet again, is another solid card if you're playing in the black color. It's definitely one of those cards that if it sticks around for too long, your opponent's going to slowly drain. And, you know, drawing cards is really how they answer cards like Shieldred. And then every time we draw a card, we're going to gain 2 life. So definitely solid card there. Edgar is another one of those interesting cards, kind of like Wedding Announcement. It's a 4/4 for 4. If it dies, we get to return to the battlefield, transform on the other side. And on the other side, at the beginning of our upkeep, we create 1/1 black white vampire creature tokens, and then it has 3 counters. It transfers back into Edgar, and then all of a sudden those vampire tokens we've created are now 2/2s on top of maybe having a Wedded Announcement. You know, upgrading the lands with Cave of Kolios, additional Shattered Sanctums are definitely very good as well. Sorin's another great Planeswalker, I think, for the deck. I know we're not super big into you know, Planeswalkers with this deck, but you know, Sorin's great in the fact that for the +1 ability, we have to look at the top card of our library, we can reveal that card, put it into our hand. If we do, we lose life equal to its mana value. -2, we get a 2/3 vampire creature token with flying and lifelink. And if we get to the -7, you can deal 13 damage to any target and gain 13 life. And then in, you know, a couple other optional cards I was taking a look at. You know, we can always add in the Aganjo and Takenuma. One of each is probably very solid for the deck, as yet again, their cards just have value on top of being a land. Henrika is another interesting card you could add to the deck. That's a, you know, it's a 1/3 flyer for 4 that at the each player, we can make each player sacrifice a creature. We can draw a card, lose a life, or we can transform it just into a 3/4 with flying, lifelink, and death touch. And then for 3 mana, each creature we control a flying, death touch, and or lifelink gets +1/+0. And then also Liliana the Veil, not a bad card. You know, it's just another good Planeswalker for black, and the fact that it costs 3 mana. We can make each player discard a card. Definitely helpful if our opponent's low on cards in hand. We can -2, make an opponent sacrifice a creature. Definitely overall very solid card. I would say, you know, for the most part, this is definitely a very solid deck. Definitely very low to the ground, you know, kind of like Sac deck that kind of has a lot of, you know, fun things that, you know, you can do with it. Overall, just you know, in general, most of these decks are just kind of like things to kind of get you started into kind of certain, you know, mechanics of the game. Definitely all have upgradable paths if you're looking to maybe play something a little bit more meta in the near future. But if you were just looking for somewhere to start, I would say any of these 5 decks are definitely good areas to start. And as we see Brothers War comes out in the next week and a half or so, we'll see if any of these decks improve, or, you know, depending on how it goes, maybe we get some new cards that we can also splash in that are also very budget friendly. But with that out of the way, if you like the video, hit that like button. Definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, you want to post new videos like this one here on the channel, hit that subscribe button. And until next time, I'll see you in the next video. Just want to give a special shout out to the channel members here on my YouTube channel. You can also become a channel member yourself down below the video, hitting that join button. It definitely helps out a lot, and I just appreciate you guys for your support.